Hello, my name is Robert Lacey from the Planning Policy Service. I'm here to give you an update on the Climate Emergency Development Plan document. The aim of today's session is to update you on the latest version of the DPD, to give you a brief overview of the work that we've carried out so far, and then to go into a little bit more detail on some key areas of our work. So why are we creating the Development Plan document? It's to address the 2019 Climate Emergency Declaration called by Cornwall Council. After that declaration, there was a pledge to create a new planning document with new policies that supplement the Cornwall Local Plan policies, specifically around climate change and the climate emergency. We've concentrated the actions of that document around our key challenges of addressing energy needs, biodiversity and nature decline and recovery, and increasing resilience of communities. It's the fastest way of creating the policies that we will need to meet the 2030 carbon neutrality target set by Cornwall Council. Throughout the process of developing our DPD, we've kept policies in thematic areas. However, those policies should be read together and against the local plan. We've tried to reduce unnecessary duplication within the DPD and with our local plan. Policies have been kept flexible so they can cover a range of scenarios, and they're adaptable so they can keep up with the changes that are being made to national policy. Further guidance is being prepared alongside the DPD to support our planning officers using the policies and for applicants making planning applications. The ambition of the policy has been set within the context of the National Planning Policy Framework and engagement with stakeholders, but some areas, such as sustainable construction, have been subject to continued work to create a more ambitious plan. A number of our policies are being developed in an emerging policy position that should be fully evolved by the time the document is submitted or examined. That includes biodiversity net gain requirement in the Environment Bill, canopy calculation in the Environment Bill as well, and announcements on the future home standards and allowing of the setting of our own energy efficiency standards. Policies will need to be kept flexible over this period to allow for further change from government and announcements on the future planning system. We've also carried out an internal conformity check, so how our new policies sit against our existing local plan policies. So where are we? We're at the final formal stage of producing the document. Our work started on the DPD in early 2020 and continued throughout the pandemic. We've had 4 periods of public consultation and engagement with our stakeholders, and those have helped to test and develop our policies. This is now the most formal stage of plan making, and that follows from our exploring issues and potential resolutions in Regulation 18 and Regulation 19 stages of the plan making process. These are now the policies that we'll submit to government if submission is supported by council. We believe that all of the comments received to the consultation on pre-submission could be resolved by minor changes, and comments and responses received to that stage will be submitted to the Planning Inspectorate alongside the Development Plan document. The submission helps to give early weight to our policies in the document, and they can start to be used in some ways following the submission of the document. As I said in the earlier slide, guidance is being developed on the policies to help planning officers and applicants to use them. And once again, national policy is still evolving. It's moving very quickly at the moment, so flexibility has been really important. The Environment Bill, we understand, will be enacted towards the end of this year. That includes formal requirements in the UK for biodiversity net gain, building regulations and future home standards. We have building regulations that will be changing in the early part of 2022, and then the Future Homes Standard from 2025. It's important to recognise that with those, with the building regulations and Future Homes Standard, we're currently proposing to go beyond those in terms of our own energy efficiency standards. And that'll be part of the testing and examination. The planning white paper is awaited. We understand that it may be published in the autumn. There's no real certainty about exactly what the future shape of a planning system will be, but at this point we believe that we will still have some years for this plan to run before we need to have a new local plan in place. There have recently been changes to the National Planning Policy Framework published, and there'll be changes to the guidance that sits alongside that, and additional permitted development rights have been allowed, including changes of use from retail and commercial to residential, which will be introduced on the 1st of August. The Climate Emergency DPD covers overall principles for development, natural climate solutions, so things like green infrastructure and natural and things like biodiversity net gain, rural development and diversification, so agriculture and agricultural policies, alternative living, town and rural centres and density, sustainable transport, renewable energy and sustainable energy and construction, and coastal change and flooding. So all of the issues that we've identified can be impacted by planning and planning policy. The themes that we've covered have remained pretty constant throughout the process, and at the initial scoping stage we asked if we were looking at the right things and that planning could influence, and there was general agreement around those subjects. Throughout the process of developing the DPD, we received a lot of interesting information and suggestions, some of which can't be addressed directly by planning or by the DPD, so we've shared that information with our relevant teams across the council so that they can feed into the other actions the council's taking to protect the environment and to address climate change. So we're just going to give you a quick focus on biodiversity net gain and our environment policies. The trajectory that's shown on this page gives you an indication of what would happen if our current approach to nature and to protection of the environment continued along the same lines. So the black line is where we've currently got to, so you can see there's been a considerable fall in the amount of biodiversity. If we carried on business as usual, so protecting the environment, there's still continued erosion of natural capital and of biodiversity, so those policies aren't enough, and if you see that's the grey line along the bottom. The yellow line does start to address those, so that's increased conservation efforts, increased protection, but really where we're aiming to be, or more than that, is the green line along the top. And that shows where you have increased conservation efforts, increased sustainability patterns, but also initiatives like biodiversity net gain, which we're hoping to embed through this document. So what is net gain? It's an approach to development that aims to leave the natural environment in a measurably better state than beforehand. So put simply, it's really to both conserve what we have, but also to increase that. And that works in line with the green diagram down the side there. So the first stage for planning is to avoid damage, and then to minimise it if you can't do that, to restore habitat if you can't minimise the damage, and then finally to compensate by providing gains away from the application site. The Environment Bill will soon update the Town and Country Planning Act, and it will require a mandatory minimum of 10% net gain requirement. So basically understanding what's on the site, measuring what's lost, how that's replaced if it is lost, and then how you get that additional 10% gain. Note the word measurably in that. So how we measure biodiversity, that's rather than physically counting exactly what's on the site, we have the DEFRA biodiversity metric, where the ecologist developing the application counts what's on site and then adds it into that metric, and that then tells you what needs to be done in terms of additional gain. It's a piece of work that's based on 10 years of pilots in the UK and uses habitat as a proxy for biodiversity. And the aim is then to actually increase the amount of biodiversity as a result of development. Cornwall Council has required 10% minimum biodiversity net gain on all major applications from the 1st of March 2020, and the plan further puts that into policy. And that means that we can, in Cornwall, be 2 years ahead of where the Environment Act will be when it becomes enacted at the end of this year. We've also added in net gain requirements on infrastructure to make sure that all forms of development are providing net gain, and over the course of this year we'll be then increasing the number of sites that need to provide net gain to include small sites using the new DEFRA metric. And this shows really where biodiversity net gains sit in terms of bolstering natural carbon sequestration. So we have policies within our plan and the Forest for Cornwall initiative that aim to plant more trees and woodlands and forests, but also then biodiversity net gain and nature recovery help to then restore seaweed habitats, wetlands, increase soil carbon capture, and restore peatland, which are all parts of absorbing carbon dioxide into our environment. And these all sit in the Natural Climate Solutions suite of policies. So these set out our approach to tackling climate and biodiversity emergencies through green infrastructure provision. It follows from our involvement in European and national learning projects and pilot projects with Natural England. The content of our policies has been simplified to make it clear what's going to be counted as biodiversity net gain. And we've also added the requirement for planting or retaining at least 15% of each site for canopy, so trees, hedgerows. That sits alongside the Forest for Cornwall project, which will be creating 8,000 hectares of tree planting in Cornwall, which equates to a 2% increase in tree cover across Cornwall. And then moving to a focus on energy, we've developed two main policies to help us address some of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions in Cornwall. So our renewables policy has been condensed from 6 policies that we had previously that were specific to different technologies, and bringing together all of our policies for wind, solar and geothermal, as well as a general principles policy and community renewables. This then avoids repetition and makes the policies more ambitious. Our homes produce almost 1/3 of our carbon emissions. A good proportion of our housing stock is poor, and around 14% of people in Cornwall live in fuel poverty. As energy costs rise, this will only worsen. So whilst we can't require retrofitting of existing homes and buildings, we've created a policy to help encourage them. And our Cornwall retrofit project, as part of Carbon Neutral Cornwall, is testing techniques and technologies to create exemplars of retrofitting that would demonstrate the best way forward. Alongside our policies, building regulations will be changing to make homes more efficient, but in the meantime, we're putting in place an additional policy requirement that will make the 3,000 plus homes that we build in Cornwall every year more efficient, saving money and energy for homeowners and reducing our emissions. Policy RE1 sets out in policy our target of 100% renewable energy by 2030, based on an average projected annual demand. It's not a new target, but one adopted by Cornwall Council in 2017, but putting it into policy gives us more weight in decision making. We recognise that it's very ambitious to get to 100% renewable energy, and we will need to allow for a broad range of renewable energy techniques if we're going to get anywhere near that target. So that mixes established technologies such as solar, so both ground and rooftop, and wind, as well as newer emerging technologies such as deep geothermal, mine water, and supporting infrastructure for offshore floating wind. And simply, unless we show areas that are broadly suitable for wind energy, we cannot grant new planning permissions other than replacing existing turbines. So alongside that, with them, we have criteria around the range of other renewable energy technologies, and our policy doesn't seek to exclude any of the technologies that would be able to help us meet those targets. We also have policies to support energy storage and investment to help create a smarter grid and ensure that power availability is there for the right time. We're continuing ongoing discussions with Western Power Distribution about the reinforcement of the grid, but importantly, these policies give additional certainty for that investment. This diagram shows the wind areas we've identified, and one barrier identified to reaching the ambitious renewable energy target was the inability for the council at the moment to grant planning permission for new wind turbines unless they're identified within our development plan. We've identified, therefore, the broad areas in which we would consider applications for turbines in line with national guidance. However, even if we do identify these areas, turbines will still need planning applications and are still subject to further technical detail, and it's not an automatic permission. The smaller map shows a landscape approach taken to identify the broad areas, and then the larger map shows the areas that we consider are broadly suitable, subject to further technical assessment. And those other assessments will need to be taken into account before permission can be granted. And those include things like wind speed, proximity to power lines, railway lines and roads, to domestic buildings, and the impact on built environment and heritage. We've also set out in policy our approach to community benefits and how developers can then demonstrate that they've engaged with the community, dealt with their planning concerns, and also how neighbourhood plans can plan for more renewables if they wish to do so. In terms of the sustainable energy and construction policy, this has been developed with the aim of tackling fuel poverty, improving the energy and water efficiency of development, and increasing the installation of renewable energy on residential and non-residential development, but also fundamentally to reduce the carbon emissions from residential, which is such a large part of our carbon emissions in Cornwall. The most significant part of this policy is the proposed requirement for all residential development to achieve net zero. And to do that, we require that new buildings are insulated and constructed to high standards and are able then to balance their energy needs by providing on-site renewables as part of the scheme. So this includes insulation, on-site renewables, so maybe rooftop solar PV, and then only where very necessary would we allow carbon offsetting to help insulate or provide solar for other housing stock in Cornwall. This anticipates the Future Home Standard introduction in 2025 and closes the gap more in advance of that. And then our other policies. AG1 supports agriculture in transforming holdings and providing positive encouragement to schemes that resolve current issues with dirty water or greenhouse gas emissions to help the agricultural industry meet its targets. The policy encourages whole farm plans and to help to prioritise investment where it's most needed. We also have a policy that draws on support in our consultations for low carbon development that supports self-sufficient lifestyles to enable groups and individuals to have low impact, sustainable off-grid living in Cornwall, where the majority of their needs could be met from the land. This is based on the Welsh system of One Planet Living, and we're currently working on the additional guidance to help implement that policy. Town centres have been in a steady process of change, and that's been sped up by the pandemic. And the aim of the policies here is to reinvigorate town centres as part of the heart of communities, reduce reliance purely on shopping, introducing new vibrant uses, and also increasing residential presence in town centres. A variety of policies within here, including a policy to help neighbourhood plans and other constituted groups to create a vision of a place that then can inform planning decisions. It also includes a policy to help increase the number of services and facilities in our rural villages to then reduce the need to travel for day-to-day living. Sustainable transport policies have been developed to ensure that new development achieves a modal shift, so a shift away from cars predominantly towards more sustainable transport modes, and puts in place requirements for new developments to be located in areas that are connected by public transport, to maximise the ability to walk and cycle, to work and to leisure, for larger schemes to offer a mix of uses to support that reduction of the need to travel, and to reflect the hierarchy of uses, so from walking through to use of a private car. Now, it doesn't seek to pretend that cars don't exist now and in the future, and will seek to accommodate them whilst influencing travel behaviour and ensuring that as many journeys, and particularly short journeys, are made by sustainable modes as possible. And then finally, our policies on coastal change and flooding, which of course are quite pertinent to Cornwall. Coastal vulnerability zone has been mapped and set out on our policies map, and development within this mapped area will need to meet a range of criteria to ensure that the proposal is not at risk from coastal change and doesn't increase the risk of coastal change for others. We've also set out a number of areas where we believe that coastal change management areas will be required either within the plan or very soon after. And development within these areas will need to demonstrate both that they meet the criteria of coastal vulnerability, but also that we can help communities to create coastal change management plans to set out in detail how communities will adapt to coastal change. So things like moving uses and infrastructure that would be lost otherwise to coastal change elsewhere within the area. We've also set out additional policy on flood risk, including the adoption of flood maps that take into account climate change, and set out a new policy that guides the development of sustainable drainage systems. In terms of next stages, we're continuing to develop the guidance approach that will run alongside this DPD when we can start using these policies in development management decisions. The document was approved to go forward to Council to recommend for submission by our Cabinet. So the document will now go to the 28th of September Council meeting. And assuming that that document is then approved for submission, we anticipate in October, November that we'll be submitting that to government in anticipation of an examination in public by early summer 2022 and adoption by autumn 22 as well. But as I say, in the meantime, we will start to give some weight to these policies